Before we begin today's presentation, here is a brief and unrelated word. Quite apart from today's subject, there is also a separate book series titled PSYOP Christianity, written by Ron Alan Curtis Ratzlaff, under the pen name The Awakened Hybrid. It is its own, entirely different investigation. That work stands on its own. Across 7 volumes, it examines historical anomalies in the origins of Christianity and makes the evidence-driven case that the faith was shaped deliberately by the Roman Empire. If that separate subject interests you, the complete series is available now on Amazon. Simply search PSYOP Christianity or scan the code on screen. Now, let us begin. This is series Renaissance Reinvention, Épisode 4. The payoff, not the appendix. 3 episodes ago, we showed you the man who built the calendar and the mathematics of the men who found the seams in it, alongside a second, independently documented case of possible Renaissance manuscript fabrication, sitting inside the very same generation. 2 episodes ago, we walked through the wreckage a hidden empire may have left across a continent, and a climate catastrophe real enough to kill millions, real enough to reshape coastlines, real enough that our textbooks still underplay it. 1 episode ago, we went east and found a church older than Rome's own Christianity, a set of manuscripts whose dating specialists still argue about using ink chemistry and parchment folds, a genetics debate that did not resolve the way its most dramatic advocate hoped, and a linguistic mystery real scientists have actually solved. Tonight, we bring all 3 episodes to a single point, and we go looking underground for it. This episode carries the investigation's own thesis, not a claim borrowed from Fomenko or Ewing or any external source. It is offered explicitly, plainly, as a hypothesis, not an absolutist conclusion, not a settled verdict, but a question this investigation believes deserves to be asked with the same rigor we have applied to every claim before it, including the honest acknowledgement of exactly where that rigor runs into its own limits. Here is the hypothesis in full. The Little Ice Age was not a mild inconvenience, remembered mainly by historians of European grain prices. It was a centuries-long, civilization-threatening catastrophe. Some populations facing that catastrophe did what humans have done, repeatedly, verifiably, across every century we have real records for. They went underground. Some came back up. Some, perhaps, did not, or built something down there worth remembering on its own terms. And the chronology that tells you every underground city on Earth is either far older or far more recent than that specific window is the same chronology this investigation spent its first episode proving was built by a specific man for specific reasons, and is not the neutral, disinterested fact it presents itself as. Notice what this episode is and is not claiming, because precision here matters more than in any episode so far. This investigation is not claiming to have identified a specific, named, physically confirmed Little Ice Age era underground city that mainstream archaeology has somehow overlooked. It is claiming something more modest and, for that reason, considerably more defensible, that the behavioral precedent for such a site is overwhelming, that at least one site meeting every relevant criterion already sits inside the conventional dating for exactly this window, that mainstream science's own recent history includes multiple cases of major underground structures going completely undetected until accident or persistence uncovered them, and that the institutions responsible for dating and interpreting the historical record have a documented history established across this series' first 3 episodes of getting chronology wrong, sometimes honestly and sometimes not. Layer those 4 established facts together, and the hypothesis that something remains undiscovered is not a leap into fantasy. It is the ordinary, conservative extrapolation of evidence this investigation has already put in front of you, the cold that textbooks undersell. Before we go underground, we need to stand once more on solid ground, because everything this episode builds rests on a foundation this investigation can defend without hedging. The Little Ice Age, most severe across roughly the 16th through 19th centuries, but beginning by many reconstructions as early as the 13th or 14th, was a real civilization-threatening catastrophe, and 2 independent documentary sources reviewed for this investigation make the case in vivid, specific, citable detail. France alone recorded 111 separate famines between 1371 and 1791. A single famine in Russia in 1601 killed roughly 500,000 people. Across the 14th through 17th centuries, foul weather and witch persecution moved together with grim reliability. In 1563, the city of Weissenberg burned 63 women to death as witches. More than 1,000 people were killed as witches in the canton of Bern, because a population watching its crops fail year after year needed somewhere to place the blame, and accused neighbors paid the price a hostile sky would not. In 1653, villagers in the French Alps sent priests armed with holy water to confront an advancing glacier, because to them it was not geology, it was a monster. The specific French Alpine case deserves a name and a location, because it is too vivid to leave anonymous. The Chamonix Valley's own residents, watching the Desbois Glacier advance year over year into their farmland, formally petitioned the Bishop of Geneva for a religious exorcism of the ice itself, and the resulting procession, complete with holy water and a formal blessing directed at the advancing glacial front, is documented in the region's own ecclesiastical and civic records, not folklore reconstructed centuries later, but a contemporary petition and a contemporary response, filed and answered by real named clergy, responding to a real, advancing physical threat. Their agricultural community had no other framework for confronting. Iceland's own documented experience of this same period is scarcely less severe. Its population, dependent on a fragile subsistence economy squeezed between advancing sea ice and a shortening growing season, saw repeated famine years throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, compounded further by volcanic disruption from eruptions like Laki in 1783, whose sulfur dioxide haze devastated crops and livestock across Iceland, and is separately documented to have contributed to unusual weather and crop failures as far away as continental Europe in the years that followed. This is not fringe material. It is the documented mainstream historical record of a climate catastrophe our general education compresses into a single throwaway sentence about cold winters when the honest record shows millions dead. Entire regions scapegoating their neighbors for a sky that would not warm, and glaciers advancing fast enough to be mistaken by people watching it happen for the end of the world. If this investigation's central thesis across 4 episodes is that our chronology and our historical record have been shaped to obscure inconvenient truths, the sheer scale of the Little Ice Age's underplayed severity is Exhibit 1, and it requires no revisionist mathematics whatsoever to prove. It only requires reading the numbers that are already sitting, uncontested, in the mainstream record to further. Specific numbers deserve to sit alongside the ones already given, because they anchor this catastrophe in a scale most general audiences have simply never been handed. Tree ring and documentary reconstructions place the coldest point of the entire Little Ice Age in the 17th century, a period cold enough that the River Thames in London froze solid enough, repeatedly, to support organized winter fairs directly on the ice, complete with vendors, entertainers, and even, on at least one documented occasion, a printing press set up on the frozen river itself to sell commemorative pamphlets to the crowds walking across it. Global population growth, which had been rising steadily across the preceding centuries, is estimated by demographic historians to have stagnated or even declined across significant portions of the 17th century in multiple regions simultaneously, not a single localized famine, but a genuinely global demographic pause, coinciding precisely with the general crisis literature this series' 2nd episode has already introduced you to. A catastrophe severe enough to freeze the Thames solid for organized commerce and to visibly bend the trajectory of global population growth is not, by any honest measure, the mild inconvenience a single throwaway textbook sentence about cold winters prepares a student to expect. The objection you are already forming, and why we are naming it ourselves. Nearly every site this episode is about to walk you through carries a conventional date that does not match the 14th through 19th century window we have just spent an entire section establishing as a genuine catastrophe. Derinkuyu, 8th century before the Common Era. Göbekli Tepe, over 9,000 years before the Common Era. Pumapunku, the 6th century of the Common Era. One notable exception exists, and this investigation will name it plainly rather than save it as a surprise. Naour, in France, is conventionally dated by mainstream French archaeology to exactly this window. No chronological reinterpretation required, and this episode has already shown it to you for precisely that reason. But Naur's is the exception, not the rule. Among the sites this episode covers, and a skeptical viewer watching everything else is entitled to ask the obvious question immediately. If most of your evidence is not actually dated to your own proposed catastrophe, what exactly are you presenting? Here is the honest answer, offered without evasion. Under the chronological compression argument, this investigation spent its first episode building Scaliger's constructed timeline, Fomenko's statistically flagged duplicate dynasties, the circularly calibrated radiocarbon method, the 19th century Egyptologists who could not agree on a foundational date within 2,000 years of each other, the ancient labels attached to these underground sites are not neutral facts of nature. They are outputs of the same chronological apparatus this series has already shown you was built by a specific man for specific institutional reasons and subsequently proven in at least one fully documented case to have been used for outright forgery. If that apparatus compressed or displaced centuries elsewhere in the record, as Fomenko's statistics suggest it may have, then a site currently labeled 8th century before the Common Era is not automatically, definitionally, 8th century before the Common Era. It is a site the Scaligerian framework has assigned that date to, and this investigation has already shown you at length why that framework's assignments deserve scrutiny rather than automatic trust. This is a hypothesis, not a proof, and it carries a real methodological risk this investigation is obligated to name rather than hide. If any inconvenient date can always be explained away as an error in Scaliger's framework, the underlying claim becomes very difficult to test. And that is precisely the criticism this series' own second episode leveled at the weakest of David Ewing's claims. We do not get to hold Ewing's numerology to a stricter standard than we hold our own closing argument. So we are not resting this episode's case on that single move alone. We are going to offer you 3 separate, competing hypotheses for the same body of evidence. And we are going to ask you, as this investigation has asked you from its very first sentence, to weigh the accumulated pattern rather than accept any one of them as a silver bullet. Kaimakla and Derinkuyu, the strongest real precedent on earth. Beneath the Cappadocia region of central Turkey sit 2 connected underground cities, Derinkuyu and Kaimakla, carved into soft volcanic rock, and their documented history is the single most important piece of evidence this episode has to offer, not because their dates match our proposed window, but because a named, credentialed witness personally recorded the underlying human behavior this hypothesis depends on in the specific act of happening. Derinkuyu was originally carved by the Phrygians in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, reaches roughly 85 meters underground, and could shelter as many as 20,000 people together with their livestock and food stores. Sealable from the inside with massive rolling stone doors, each floor independently closable against an enemy who managed to breach the level above. Kaimakla's story is the one that matters most for this investigation's argument, because it did not stop being used in the 8th century before the Common Era. It was expanded into a full defensive city starting in the 8th century of the Common Era by Christian communities defending themselves against raiders. It was deepened further during the Byzantine period, across the 5th through 10th centuries, specifically to shelter its population from Muslim-Arab raiding parties during 4 centuries of Arab-Byzantine warfare. It sheltered its population again against the Mongol incursions of Timur in the 14th century. And here is the specific record this investigation's claim rests on, checkable by anyone. It was still actively being used for exactly its original purpose as late as 1909, when a Cambridge linguist named Richard McGillivray Dawkins personally documented Cappadocian Greek villagers taking refuge underground in response to news of a massacre in a nearby city, not venturing back to the surface for several nights, a named academic's own field notes, not a folkloric retelling. The underground city was not finally abandoned until 1923. Derinkuyu and Kaymakla are not isolated curiosities either. They sit within a documented network of at least 200 separate underground settlements identified across the wider Cappadocia region, connected in places by tunnels running for kilometers between individual complexes, meaning the region's population did not build one refuge, but an entire interconnected subterranean civilization spanning multiple named towns. In 2014, this pattern received a genuinely dramatic confirmation. Construction work beneath a hilltop castle in the modern Turkish city of Nevşehir uncovered what preliminary archaeological surveys described as an entirely separate, previously unknown underground city, estimated by some of the researchers involved to be larger in overall volume than Derinkuyu itself, its full extent still not completely mapped even today. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In the 21st century, using modern construction equipment, a major underground complex in this exact region went completely undetected until routine urban development activity stumbled onto it by accident, direct. Recent, well-documented proof that even a region as intensively studied and as thoroughly touristed as Cappadocia can still be hiding major underground structures nobody currently knows exist, discovered only when someone happens to dig in exactly the right spot. Sit with that timeline for a moment, because it is the whole argument in miniature. A single underground refuge complex in continuous or intermittent use for protection from external catastrophe across roughly 2,700 years, from the 8th century before the Common Era to 1923. If a structure can serve this exact function across nearly 3 millennia, spanning Phrygian pagans, Byzantine Christians, and early 20th century villagers fleeing a massacre, then the claim that some population, somewhere, facing the Little Ice Age's centuries of documented famine and social collapse, might have done exactly the same thing, is not a claim this investigation invented out of nothing. It is a claim built on the single best attested behavioral pattern in the entire archaeological record of underground construction. The Cambridge linguist's own eyewitness account deserves one further moment, because Richard McGillivray Dawkins was not a casual tourist stumbling onto a curiosity. He was a professional academic conducting serious fieldwork on Cappadocian Greek dialect and folklore, and his personal, documented observation of villagers retreating underground upon hearing news of a nearby massacre is exactly the kind of first-person, credentialed, contemporaneous testimony this entire series has insisted every claim needs and too rarely gets. Dawkins did not hear a second-hand rumor of ancient refuge behavior. He watched a Greek-speaking Cappadocian community in living memory in the 20th century execute a defensive maneuver whose basic logic: go underground, seal the entrances, wait out the danger, had been passed down through that same regional population for millennia. Whether or not any individual villager in 1909 could have named a single one of their Phrygian or Byzantine predecessors who had done exactly the same thing centuries earlier, knows the single best dated underground refuge city in this entire investigation. If Kaymakla is this episode's strongest evidence for the underlying human behavior, the underground city of Naurs in the Somme region of northern France is this episode's strongest evidence for something even more specific: a real, physically surviving, extensively documented underground refuge complex whose actual dates of use sit squarely inside the little Ice Age window this entire episode has been built around, with no chronological compression, no Scaligerian reinterpretation, and no hedging required. Naurs began its existence as an ordinary chalk quarry, and mainstream French archaeology, drawing on documented research by France's own National Institute for Preventive Archaeological Research, dates the site's transformation into a genuine underground refuge to the 15th century of the Common Era, when the local Picard population began using the tunnels as what French historical sources call mouches, a regional term for hidden underground refuges, specifically to escape the recurring waves of war and invasion that struck Picardy across the following 3 centuries. This is not a single, isolated use. Local populations returned to Naurs again and again, employing documented concealment strategies to avoid detection across a use window that runs directly through the 15th, 16th, 17th, and into the 18th century, meaning Naurs was in active, repeated, documented use as a civilian refuge for the entire duration of the Little Ice Age's most severe centuries. Precisely the window this episode has spent its opening minutes establishing as a real, civilization-threatening catastrophe. Unlike Kaymakla's use stretching back to Phrygian antiquity or Derinkuyu's contested pre-Christian origins, Naurs requires no chronological reinterpretation whatsoever to fit this investigation's proposed window. It simply does, on the mainstream, uncontested, conventional dating every French archaeological authority already assigns to it. Naurs's later history adds a second, entirely different kind of evidentiary value. The underground network was effectively forgotten by the wider public through the 19th century until a local priest rediscovered and began systematically exploring the tunnels in the 1880s, opening them to tourism by the early 20th century, and then, during the First World War, thousands of Allied and German soldiers passing through the region left behind pencil-carved graffiti on the tunnel walls, signing their names, units, and hometowns. An accidental soldiers' archive that modern historians have since catalogued and used to trace individual units' movements through the region with a level of granular, first-person detail no official military record alone could provide. Naurs is, In other words, a single site that gives this investigation everything at once. Mainstream dated medieval refuge use falling squarely inside the proposed catastrophe window, a real historical rediscovery narrative, and a second, unrelated layer of 20th century human testimony, carved directly into the same stone by soldiers who had no idea they were adding their own names to a 500-year-old refuge's history. Naurs is not, this investigation must note plainly, entirely unique in France, only unusually well documented. French regional historians have identified similar muches across other parts of Picardy and neighboring regions, smaller and less thoroughly excavated than Naurs, but following the same general pattern of quarry-turned-refuge use across the same broad centuries, meaning Naurs should be understood not as a singular anomaly, but as the best preserved and most fully studied example of what appears to have been a genuinely regional, repeated, ordinary, medieval and early modern French practice. One general Western education has simply never had occasion to teach, because it never had reason to organize a lesson plan around northern French peasants hiding from war in the ground. Göbekli Tepe. Even mainstream archaeology admits some sites were deliberately buried. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is conventionally dated to roughly 9,500 years before the Common Era, making it thousands of years too old to fit our proposed window under any honest reading, and its relevance here is not about its date, but about what happened to it. Its massive carved stone enclosures were found by archaeologists intentionally backfilled with rubble, deliberately buried by the very people who built them, sometime around 8,000 years before the Common Era. Mainstream archaeology's leading interpretation is that this represents a ritual decommissioning practice, enclosures ceremonially retired and buried when their use concluded, rather than an act of concealment from a cataclysm or from later observers. And this remains a genuinely open, actively debated question in the specialist literature, because the actual motive behind the burial has never been directly documented, only inferred. Göbekli Tepe's own discovery story adds a second layer worth knowing. Local farmers in the region had been aware of unusual worked stones on the hilltop for generations, and a preliminary American-led archaeological survey in the 1960s actually walked the site and dismissed it, cataloging it as an unremarkable medieval cemetery, entirely missing what lay beneath. It took the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt revisiting the same hilltop in 1994 with fresh eyes and a hunch that the earlier survey had gotten it wrong, to recognize the true scale and age of what was actually buried there, meaning one of the single most important prehistoric discoveries of the modern era sat under a formal, credentialed, published misidentification for roughly 3 decades before anyone thought to look again. A comparable pattern shows up much closer to this episode's own proposed window in the underground cities of Cappadocia this episode has already introduced you to. Mainstream archaeologists studying Derinkuyu and its neighbors have independently proposed as one leading working theory among several that the tunnel's deliberately narrow, low, defensible passages, its sealable rolling stone doors, and its carefully engineered ventilation shafts were designed not only to shelter people, but specifically to disguise the settlement's true scale and population from anyone who managed to breach the outer levels, meaning concealment of exactly the kind this episode's central hypothesis proposes was not merely possible in the pre-modern world, but was, according to mainstream specialists studying the single best documented underground refuge network on Earth, an actual deliberate design goal built directly into the architecture. We include Göbekli Tepe not as evidence for our specific hypothesis, which its date rules out under any conventional or even moderately compressed chronology, but as a corrective to a very common misconception. The idea that ancient people didn't bury things on purpose is simply false. Even mainstream, fully credentialed archaeology accepts, as an uncontested fact, that ancient human beings sometimes deliberately buried enormous, monumental structures, and that the reason why remains a live question rather than a settled one. If the builders of Göbekli Tepe could choose to bury their own monument and take their reasons with them into a debate, archaeologists are still having 11,000 years later the idea that a medieval or early modern population might have done something comparable for their own reasons and left behind a record our chronology has simply misfiled is not asking you to believe anything more exotic than what the specialists already accept happened once. The astrology thread, why so much ancient sky knowledge was kept underground. One further thread belongs in this investigation before it turns to the city-by-city accounting, because it addresses a specific intuition this investigation's own research process, flagged early and set aside for proper treatment. A real, documented, mainstream studied connection between underground ritual space and the deliberate transmission of astronomical and astrological knowledge, running for centuries directly beneath the streets of the Roman Empire's own cities, including Rome itself. The Roman mystery cult of Mithraism, which spread across the empire from roughly the 1st through 4th centuries of the Common Era, built its temples called Mithraea almost exclusively underground, either as adapted natural caves or as purpose-built chambers explicitly designed to imitate a cave, a design choice the religion's own surviving texts describe as a deliberate representation of the universe itself. The central image found in nearly every excavated Mithraeum, a carved relief called the Tauroctony, showing the god Mithras slaying a bull, is surrounded with a consistent, repeating set of astronomical symbols, figures representing the 12 zodiac signs, the sun, the moon, and a raven, a lion, and a serpent, whose specific arrangement scholars of Roman religion, most prominently the historian David Ulansey, have argued encodes a genuine astronomical event, the precession of the equinoxes, the slow, multi-thousand-year wobble of Earth's rotational axis that gradually shifts which zodiac constellation appears to rise at spring equinox. A phenomenon the Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited with formally identifying in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Ulanse's specific interpretation remains debated among specialists in Roman religion, and this investigation states that debate plainly rather than presenting his reading as unanimous consensus. But the underlying fact his theory is built on top of is not remotely in dispute. An enormous, empire-wide religious movement spent 4 centuries conducting its central rituals inside deliberately cave-like underground chambers explicitly built to represent the cosmos, surrounded by carved astronomical symbolism in city after city across the Roman world, including multiple Mithraea excavated directly beneath Rome itself, one preserved today beneath the Basilica of San Clemente. This gives this investigation's user-flagged astrology underground intuition a real, if narrower and more historically specific foundation to stand on. It is not that astrology as a general discipline was invented underground, or that some lost civilization first developed astronomical knowledge in tunnels before bringing it to the surface. The astronomical knowledge Mithraism encoded was itself drawn from well-documented earlier Babylonian and Hellenistic astronomy, developed and recorded in observatories and libraries under the open sky, not underground. What is genuinely, verifiably true is narrower and, in its own way, just as interesting. A specific, historically massive, empire-spanning religious tradition made the deliberate choice, for 4 consecutive centuries, to conduct its most important rituals and preserve its most sophisticated cosmological symbolism specifically underground, treating subterranean space as the correct architectural setting for humanity's relationship to the stars, meaning underground space and sky knowledge really were linked repeatedly, deliberately, and for a very long time, in the exact civilization whose administrative and religious apparatus later gave the Western world its calendar in the first place. Mithraism was not the first tradition to make that link, and one further site, on a different continent and thousands of years earlier, deserves to be named here for exactly this reason. Newgrange, a passage tomb in County Meath, Ireland, was built around 3,100 years before the Common Era, making it older than both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, and it was engineered with a level of astronomical precision that is not remotely in dispute among mainstream archaeologists. Its internal passage is aligned so precisely that on the winter solstice, and only the winter solstice, the rising sun's light travels down the entire 79-foot passage and illuminates the tomb's inner chamber for a period of roughly 17 minutes, an effect that has been directly observed and filmed by archaeologists and the public in the modern era, and that requires the kind of sustained, generational, astronomical observation typically associated with far more advanced civilizations built millennia later. Newgrange itself was largely forgotten by the wider world for millennia after its Neolithic builders' descendants stopped maintaining it, its entrance eventually collapsing and sealing itself with debris until local landowners rediscovered the passage in 1699, and it was not systematically excavated until archaeologist Michael J. O'Kelly's formal work between 1962 and 1975 finally confirmed the solstice alignment scientifically rather than merely anecdotally. This is, once again, the exact pattern this episode keeps finding wherever it looks. Precise, sophisticated astronomical knowledge deliberately built into a structure specifically designed to channel that knowledge through a dark, enclosed, underground adjacent space, subsequently lost to memory for thousands of years, and only recovered by a specialist willing to look closely at something everyone else had walked past for centuries. A city-by-city accounting. Paris's famous catacombs were formally established in 1810, built from far older Roman-era limestone quarries, and the reason was almost comically mundane. The city's overflowing cemeteries were causing literal wall collapses, spilling decomposing remains into neighboring basements throughout the 1780s, and moving the bones underground was a public health measure, not a catastrophe response. But the tunnels themselves, 150 kilometers of them, existed for centuries before anyone decided to put bones inside them, carved out gradually as the city quarried its own building stone from beneath its own streets. London offers less to work with in the way of ancient or medieval refuge cities, but it deserves a fairer hearing than a single dismissive sentence, because its 20th century underground record is genuinely richer than its most famous piece of infrastructure, the Post Office Railway, that opened in 1927 to move mail between sorting offices, suggests on its own 8 deep-level shelters, each a pair of parallel tunnels running 1,200 feet long beneath existing London Underground stations, were built during the Second World War, originally planned to hold 10,000 people apiece before final capacity settled closer to 8,000 per shelter. Chancery Lane, Belsize Park, Camden Town, Goodge Street, Stockwell, Clapham North, Clapham Common, and Clapham South. Construction began during the Blitz in 1940 in direct response to public demand, but the shelters were not actually completed until 1942, after the worst of the Blitz had already passed, so the government initially used them itself rather than the public. The Goodge Street shelter reportedly served General Eisenhower, and the Chancery Lane shelter operated as a wartime communications center before 5 of the 8 were finally opened to civilians in 1944 as bombing intensified again. 2 further planned shelters at St. Paul's and Oval stations were never completed at all, abandoned mid-construction over structural concerns and difficult ground conditions respectively, meaning London's own underground wartime record includes not only what was built, but 2 documented cases of underground construction begun and then deliberately halted. The nearby Kingsway Telephone Exchange, built to similarly hardened wartime specifications, continued to operate as sensitive government communications infrastructure well into the Cold War period, adding one more layer of 20th century subterranean secrecy to a city whose famously deep clay geology, as this investigation has already noted, made building downward an unusually practical option every time London faced an existential threat. Rome's catacombs are extensive and real. At least 40 separate complexes and more than 150 kilometers of tunnels, with burials beginning in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Driven by an ordinary Roman legal ban on burial within city limits, combined with straightforward overcrowding, some catacombs remained undiscovered until as late as the 1950s, which is a genuinely interesting fact about how much can hide beneath a heavily studied city, even when the tunnel's purpose is not remotely mysterious. It is worth returning, briefly, to the Mithraea this episode has already introduced you to, because Rome's underground religious architecture did not stop at burial tunnels. The city's own soil holds multiple excavated Mithraic temples in addition to its catacombs, including one preserved directly beneath the Basilica of San Clemente, and others recovered from beneath the baths of Caracalla and the Circus Maximus, meaning ancient Rome's relationship to its own underground was considerably richer than tourist itineraries built around the catacombs alone tend to suggest, encompassing burial, ritual, and cosmological symbolism, all sharing the same subterranean real estate across different centuries and different purposes. Moscow's two hidden facilities, Berlin's open secret, and what Oslo teaches us by having nothing to hide. Moscow gives this investigation its richest modern case study, and the sourcing here goes well beyond rumor. In 2005, a BBC Radio 4 journalist was personally taken underground by a member of an actual Moscow urban exploration collective called the Diggers of the Underground Planet, and filed a first-person report describing tunnels wide enough for a train or a tank, reportedly running some 25 kilometers beneath the city. 2 years before that, in 1997, the Russian newspaper Moscow Kuranty published an interview with an anonymous Russian tunneling expert who, while personally denying some of the more sensational claims circulating in Western reporting at the time, directly confirmed that a line he called the Kremlin Line, commissioned in 1967, genuinely links the former Central Committee building on Staraya Ploshchad and the Kremlin itself to an underground town at Ramenki and to the Vnukovo 2 government airport. This is Metro 2, codenamed D6 by the KGB, an informally designated, still only partially and reluctantly acknowledged deep underground system, reportedly begun under Stalin, built to give Soviet leadership secure wartime evacuation routes and command posts, including a bunker beneath the Kremlin itself. A Russian journalist who wrote about this network was called in for questioning by the FSB, the KGB's successor agency, simply for publishing what he had learned. American intelligence was watching the ground beneath Moscow long before any of this became public rumor. A United States Central Intelligence Agency report, originally classified secret and obtained in part through the Department of the Navy in May of 1950, catalogued the depth of individual Moscow subway stations, station by station, some as shallow as 4 to 6 meters, others as deep as 15 to 25 meters, and noted that several of the deeper stations carried unusually heavy telecommunications cable routing. That document, declassified decades later and now publicly viewable, does not prove Metro 2, as later described it, explicitly attributes the varying depths mainly to Moscow's own uneven topography, not to a uniform hidden design, but it confirms something simpler and, for this investigation's purposes, sufficient on its own. A foreign intelligence service found the physical structure of Moscow's underground worth, secretly cataloguing station by station as early as 1950, which is itself evidence that more was going on beneath that city than a simple public transit system years before any digger or defector said a word about it. Separately, Bunker 42, the Tagansky Protected Command Point, was a genuinely secret Soviet military bunker complex, construction beginning in 1951, fully operational by 1956, designed to withstand a nuclear strike with its own air recycling and diesel power, since declassified and converted into a public Cold War museum. Moscow, in other words, is a city that has already, within living memory, built and hidden not one, but two major underground facilities, one of which, a national intelligence service, was still actively suppressing reporting on as recently as this century. One further detail belongs in the Moscow record, because it shows the same secrecy pattern extending well beyond the Soviet period into contemporary Russia. St. Petersburg was also examined for this investigation as a candidate city, and intellectual honesty requires reporting the negative result plainly. Despite extensive searching, no comparably documented deep underground command network, equivalent to Moscow's Metro 2, was found for St. Petersburg specifically, and this investigation declines to manufacture a parallel claim it cannot support with comparable sourcing. A fair jury does not pad its strongest city with an invented twin simply because the two cities share a national government. Berlin offers this investigation something different, an example of the same underground secrecy behavior, but one an organized, credentialed institution now works to actively document rather than suppress. The Berliner Unterwelten Association, a real, established German non-profit, not a fringe rumor site, conducts ongoing public research and guided tours of Berlin's underground history under headings including flak towers, subways, bunkers, and the Cold War, and under the Berlin Wall, and maintains dedicated exhibits on a nuclear bunker at Pankstrasse, a World War II-era Humboldt flak tower, and a documented, converted subway line. Where Moscow's Metro 2 remains officially unacknowledged, Berlin's equivalent Cold War bunker network has become fully, formally documented, publicly toured, and academically researched, meaning the same underlying behavior, a major world capital burying command infrastructure beneath its own streets during an existential threat, produced two very different institutional outcomes. One city eventually opened its underground record to the public. The other still has an intelligence agency asking questions of journalists who report on it. Both cities prove the same underlying point from opposite directions. It is worth asking, honestly, why one government chose disclosure and the other chose continued denial decades after the Cold War itself ended, and the most defensible answer this investigation can offer is not conspiratorial at all. Germany's post-war political settlement required, as an explicit condition of its own reconstructed national identity, a public reckoning with its authoritarian past, while Russia's post-Soviet state never underwent an equivalent formal reckoning with its own security apparatus, leaving the old institutional habit of reflexive secrecy largely intact, even after the ideology that originally justified it collapsed. That is a mundane, entirely explicable, non-conspiratorial answer, and it is also, itself, a small demonstration of exactly this series' recurring point. Institutions do not lie about their own history uniformly or for identical reasons everywhere. They lie or tell the truth according to their own specific incentives, and a fair investigation has to examine each institution's specific incentive rather than assuming either universal honesty or universal conspiracy as a default setting. The specific 2005 BBC and 1997 Moscow Courant reporting this episode has already cited stands as exactly the kind of independent, cross-checked, dual-sourced journalism this series has asked its audience to demand of every claim throughout a Western public broadcaster and a Russian domestic newspaper working independently of each other, years apart, converging on the same basic description of a tunnel network neither government has ever fully confirmed. Oslo, by contrast, offers this investigation nothing, and intellectual honesty requires saying so plainly rather than stretching the evidence to fit. Its metro system began as a surface tram in 1898, went underground in 1928, and became a full metro only in 1966, entirely conventional 20th century infrastructure. With no ancient or medieval refuge city documented anywhere nearby, not every world capital has a mysterious underground history, and a fair investigation shows you the negative cases as readily as the positive ones. And in South America, the Pumapunku complex in Bolivia, conventionally dated to construction beginning after the year 536 of the Common Era, is worth one closing note of genuine interest. 536 is the same year as a real, independently documented, global volcanic dust veil event, visible in ice cores and tree rings, and recorded by Byzantine and Chinese historians alike. The same catastrophic climate disruption already cited in this series' first episode. Pumapunku's conventional date sits directly at the edge of a real, proven climate catastrophe, a different, much earlier one than the Little Ice Age, but a reminder that the pattern of civilizations under climate stress leaving behind monumental construction is not confined to any single century. The 536 event itself deserves naming plainly, because it is one of mainstream climate history's own best documented ancient catastrophes, a massive volcanic eruption whose exact source is still debated among specialists, but whose global atmospheric effects are not, produced a persistent dust veil that dimmed sunlight across the northern hemisphere for well over a year. Contemporary Byzantine historian Procopius, recording that the sun gave forth its light without brightness for the entire period, and Chinese chronicles independently recording snow in summer and widespread crop failure in the same years. Modern ice core and tree ring reconstructions have confirmed this was very likely the single coldest decade of at least the past 2,000 years across large parts of the globe. Pumapunku and the broader Tiwanaku civilization it belonged to, on the conventional archaeological chronology accepted by mainstream specialists and reflected in Tiwanaku's own UNESCO World Heritage listing, underwent significant construction and political consolidation in the centuries immediately following this exact climate shock, meaning even without touching a single Scaligian compression argument, the mainstream conventionally dated archaeological record of South America already shows a major Andean civilization building some of its most monumental architecture in the direct aftermath of a documented global climate catastrophe, which is precisely the pattern this entire episode has been asking you to take seriously about the Little Ice Age, demonstrated here on a completely different continent, in a completely different millennium, using nobody's revisionist chronology at all. 3 hypotheses, not one. We promised at the top of this episode that we would not rest this case on a single unfalsifiable move, and here is where we honor that promise. 3 separate, competing hypotheses can explain the pattern this episode has laid out, and this investigation asks you to weigh all 3 rather than accept the first one that appeals to you. The first hypothesis is chronology compression, that these sites are misdated by the Scaligian framework this series spent its first episode dismantling, and may in fact belong to a more recent, compressed timeline that overlaps the Little Ice Age far more closely than their conventional dates admit. The second hypothesis accepts the conventional dates entirely and argues instead from behavior. Humans have repeatedly, verifiably, across every century where we have real records, responded to existential threats by building underground, and it is entirely plausible that Little Ice Age era refuges were built, used, and abandoned without ever being identified by later archaeologists as what they actually were not, because no such site exists, but because nobody has yet gone looking for one under that specific description. The third hypothesis is the most speculative, and the one this investigation labels most carefully, that the same elite institutions this series has already shown you rewrote chronology, invented forgeries, and profited from war and empire may also possess a demonstrated historical willingness to sacrifice mass human welfare for infrastructure and profit when it served their interests. Here is the checkable record the claim rests on, not an assertion asking to be taken on faith. The construction of the Suez Canal, its labor contracts, its diplomatic correspondence, and its mortality figures are documented in named company and government archives anyone can examine directly. Between 1859 and 1869, the Suez Canal Company drew on Egypt's corvée system, a form of unpaid compulsory labor conscripted directly from the fellahin, the Egyptian peasantry, until international diplomatic pressure, principally from Britain, forced Said Pasha's successors to formally halt it in 1864. By some estimates, more than 1.5 million laborers passed through the project over its decade of construction, with over 30,000 working at any given time, and tens of thousands are recorded as dying, many from cholera and related epidemics that swept the work camps. The Suez Canal Company itself, chartered under Ferdinand de Lesseps with concessions granted directly by the Egyptian ruler Said Pasha, financed the project substantially through European and especially French private investment, meaning the corvée labor extracted from Egypt's own peasantry was, in material fact, subsidizing a return on capital for foreign shareholders who never set foot in the canal zone themselves, precisely the kind of structural arrangement elite financial interests extracting value from a captive, unfree labor force while remaining physically and legally insulated from the human cost, that this investigation's third hypothesis proposes is a recurring, demonstrated historical pattern rather than a one-time exception. The exact death toll remains a genuinely open, contested historical question in its own right. Gamal Abdel Nasser cited a figure of 120,000 deaths when he nationalized the canal in 1956, while the canal company's own chief medical officer reported a rate no higher than 2.5 deaths per thousand workers in 1866, a rate that, extrapolated conservatively across the full workforce and decade, would put the real total closer to a few thousand, and by the most literal reading of the surviving company records, fewer than 1,000. That range, from under 1,000 to 120,000, is itself a demonstration of how thoroughly the historical record of mass infrastructure projects can be shaped after the fact by whoever controls the surviving paperwork. A theme this series has returned to in every episode. What is not contested is that a major European commercial enterprise used compulsory, unpaid labor on a mass scale, that it did so until an external power intervened rather than any internal reform, and that people died of preventable disease in numbers substantial enough that even the most conservative reading of the record cannot describe the project as bloodless. Whether that same class of institution might also know how to anticipate, survive, or even trigger a civilizational reset event is a genuinely open question this investigation raises and does not claim to answer. It is the largest inferential leap of the three hypotheses, and it should be weighed as such. A fair-minded skeptic is right to observe that a chronology which can absorb any inconvenient date is difficult to test. This investigation's answer is not to abandon the hypothesis, but to widen the aperture. Weigh the accumulated pattern across all 4 episodes, a demonstrably constructed calendar, a demonstrated case of Renaissance forgery, a real and underplayed civilizational catastrophe, a well-attested human behavior of building underground during exactly that kind of catastrophe, and a documented history of elite institutions manipulating populations for their own benefit rather than resting the entire case on any single claim's ability to withstand every possible objection alone. Weigh the 3 hypotheses against each other honestly, one final time, rather than picking a favorite by instinct. The chronology compression hypothesis is the most intellectually exciting and the hardest to independently test. because it depends on accepting Fomenko's broader statistical program, which this series has already told you remains unreplicated rather than proven. The behavioral precedent hypothesis is the most conservative and the easiest to defend, because it requires believing nothing more than that humans, facing the exact catastrophe this episode has documented in detail, did what humans have always verifiably done when facing catastrophe: build downward, and it asks only that at least one such site remains undiscovered, rather than that all of archaeology's conventional dating is systematically wrong. The institutional culpability hypothesis is the most morally serious and the hardest to resolve, because the Suez Canal's documented forced labor record proves the underlying capacity for institutional cruelty beyond any reasonable doubt, while the leap from that proven capacity to any specific claim about deliberately causing or concealing a climate catastrophe remains, and should remain, unproven. An honest investigation does not need to declare a winner among these three. It needs only to show you that none of the three requires you to believe anything this series has not already, separately, established with real evidence. The verdict of the series. 4 episodes ago, this investigation opened with a simple, almost embarrassingly obvious question that Western education somehow manages never to ask its students directly: who built the clock, and why does everyone still set their watch by it without checking the mechanism? We have spent 4 episodes answering it as honestly as the evidence allows. Joseph Scaliger was a real man with real patrons who built a real, artificial, chronological system, and the historical record proves, in the specific and fully documented case of Annius of Viterbo, that men exactly like him were capable of, and did commit, outright chronological forgery when it served their interests. Anatoly Fomenko's statistical challenge to that system remains mathematically serious, unreplicated, and tellingly never refuted with comparable rigor, only dismissed with institutional confidence. David Ewing Jr.'s evidentiary corpus contained real, underappreciated facts stretched past their limits. At least one claim that collapsed on contact with basic statistics, and at least one genuinely underexplored architectural mystery mainstream science has not yet fully closed. Armenia's true chronological primacy, the real dating disputes inside the Targumic tradition, and the real convergent evolution of Maya and Japanese writing all showed us cases where the honest answer sometimes vindicates the mainstream account and sometimes vindicates the skeptic, often in the very same episode. And tonight, a real, underplayed climate catastrophe met a real 3,000-year-old human behavior of building downward to survive, layered under a chronology. This series has already shown you good reason to distrust, and topped with a genuinely open question about what the people who profit from that chronology might also be capable of hiding or causing. Look back across the specific, named pieces of evidence this final episode alone has put in front of you, because the sheer range of them is itself worth one last moment of attention. K. Muckler's nearly 3,000-year documented span of refuge use, from Phrygian pagans to Cambridge-documented Greek villagers fleeing a massacre in 1909, Naoza's mainstream dated 15th through 18th century muches, no chronological reinterpretation required, later scrawled over by First World War soldiers who had no idea they were adding to a 500-year-old refuge's history. A 2014 construction accident in Nevşehir, uncovering an underground city potentially larger than Derinkuyu, in a region tourists have walked through for decades. A Roman mystery religion that spent 4 centuries conducting its rituals in deliberately cave-shaped chambers, encoding real astronomical knowledge. A Moscow tunnel network, still only partially acknowledged by the government that built it, standing beside a Berlin equivalent that same government's Cold War rival chose to fully document and open to the public. A volcanic dust veil in 536 that dimmed the sun over 2 continents and preceded a real Andean civilization's most monumental building phase. And a Suez Canal whose true human cost still cannot be stated with confidence to within 2 orders of magnitude, depending entirely on whose figures you choose to trust. One final observation belongs to Naoz specifically, because it is the single cleanest answer this episode can offer to its own opening question. Every other site this episode has walked you through required either a chronological argument, a behavioral inference, or an institutional motive hypothesis to connect it to the Little Ice Age. Naoz required none of those. It required only that someone go and check the conventional, mainstream, entirely uncontested French archaeological dating already sitting in the published record, and the record, once checked, already said exactly what this episode's central hypothesis proposed, without needing a single revisionist argument to say it. None of this, taken individually, proves the specific hypothesis this episode set out to test. Taken together, it proves something the series has been building toward across 4 full episodes, that the ground beneath our feet, quite literally in this closing case, has a demonstrated habit of holding more than official history initially credits it with, and that the only reliable way to find out what is actually down there is to keep digging, keep checking primary sources, and keep naming plainly the difference between what the evidence supports and what merely sounds like it should be true. That is the case this investigation has built. Not history is a lie. Not the textbooks are beyond question. Something narrower, and for that reason, something far more durable than either comfortable extreme. History and chronology are human institutions, built by fallible people with real interests, revisable in light of better evidence. Exactly like the money in your pocket and the religion in your neighbor's heart, worth believing only as far as the evidence for believing it actually reaches, and not 1 inch further. Consider the full roster of names this 4-episode investigation has actually put in front of you, because that roster is itself the strongest evidence for the method underneath it. A Renaissance scholar who invented an emperor's ancestor from nothing. A Soviet mathematician whose statistics remain unrefuted 20 years after publication. An independent YouTube creator whose real discoveries and real overreach sat side by side in the same videos. A Cambridge scholar excavating a Cairo storeroom no one had thought to search in 9 centuries. A Spanish bishop who burned a library and, by accident, left behind the exact notes that let it speak again 400 years later. A German archaeologist who trusted his own eyes over a published, credentialed survey that had gotten it wrong. A Russian journalist called in for questioning by his own government's intelligence service for reporting on tunnels that official Moscow still will not fully acknowledge. None of these people agree with each other. Several of them would consider the other's work an embarrassment. This investigation has tried to give each of them exactly what the evidence they personally produced actually earned, no more, no less, and that, more than any single conclusion about Scaliger, Fomenko, Ewing, Armenia, Khazaria, or the ground beneath Moscow, is the actual thesis of Renaissance reinvention. Not a specific verdict about the past, but a demonstrated method for reaching one, available to anyone willing to go check the primary sources for themselves, rather than accepting any single voice's account of them, mainstream or dissident alike. One closing acknowledgement belongs here, addressed directly to the person who has sat through all 4 episodes, rather than only this one. You have watched this investigation praise Fomenko's mathematics and then dismantle his numerology in the very same breath. You have watched it defend Ewing's Arabic coinage and then correct his star forts within a single episode. You have watched it hand Shlomo Sand a fair, sympathetic hearing and then report that the genetics currently weigh against his strongest claim. You have watched it credit Poggio Bracciolini with rescuing Lucretius from oblivion, and then name the live scholarly dispute over whether he also forged Tacitus. That inconsistency is not a flaw in this investigation's method. It is the entire method working exactly as intended on every source it was ever pointed at, without exception, for 4 full episodes running. If you came to this series hoping it would simply confirm a conclusion you already held, mainstream or dissident, it likely disappointed you at least once along the way. That disappointment was the point. A method that only ever tells you what you already wanted to hear was never actually a method at all. It was a mirror wearing the costume of an investigation. And this series has tried, across 4 full episodes and a great many named sources, to be something more durable than that. That durability is the only thing this investigation ultimately asks you to carry forward. Not a specific belief about Scaliger or Fomenko or a fortress beneath Moscow, but a habit of mind. Check the primary source. Name the incentive, weigh the evidence on its own terms that will serve you exactly as well the next time someone hands you a confident, tidy, unexamined account of the past. Whichever direction that account happens to be leaning, we have shown you the evidence. 4 episodes of it, gathered from Renaissance manuscript archives, Soviet mathematics, an independent YouTube creator's contested catalog, Cairo storerooms, Cappadocian tunnels, a French chalk quarry's soldier graffiti, a Roman cave temple's zodiac carvings, and the frozen surface of the Thames. The verdict is now yours to render, and this investigation trusts you to render it the same way it has tried, across 4 full episodes, to reach every one of its own, patiently, skeptically, and with the primary sources open on the table in front of you, regardless of which direction those sources ultimately lead. Renaissance Reinvention ends here, but the method it has spent 4 episodes demonstrating does not have to. Somewhere, right now, a manuscript is sitting misfiled, a tunnel is sitting unmapped, and a footnote is sitting uncited, waiting for the next person willing to go and check. That person does not need a degree, a television budget, or an institutional letterhead. Nevşehir's own underground city was found by a construction crew, not a university department. History rewards the person who simply goes and looks, checks the primary source with their own eyes, and reports honestly, plainly, and without exaggeration on exactly what they found there, whether it confirms the hypothesis they went in hoping to prove, or quietly, stubbornly refuses to. End of episode 4. End of Renaissance Reinvention. This presentation was produced by Creatic Media, a veteran-owned digital studio. We build production-grade progressive web apps and custom software. Our own trivia platform, Muse Ion Trivia, shows exactly what we can deliver for your business. We also offer fully built business websites and ready-to-launch templates, from done-for-you sites to affordable starter designs. We also create marketing commercials using localized on-premise AI, giving small businesses broadcast quality ads for a fraction of the cost of a full marketing team. And because everything runs on our own hardware, your project never touches a remote data center. Your data stays private. Visit creaticmedia.com to start your project today. That concludes episode 4 and the Renaissance Reinvention series. Thank you for watching. If this investigation resonated with you, explore the PSYOP Christianity book series and subscribe for the next investigation. This has been The Awakened Hybrid.